Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for being with us online and in person. I'm Rachel Nielsen. I'll be moderating today with our esteemed panelists here. So, keeping with our theme of tertiary prevention, but also trying to dive right back in, please look up their impressive bios on the McCain website. We're going to jump back into programming. So we have three very different approaches to tertiary prevention in the targeted violence space. We have Emma Joanne with Parents for Peace, also Richard A. Warren, who runs the LEAD program in New York, and Dr. Sarah Budge, who is, sorry about that, who is with Life After Hate. So without further ado, I'm going to give each person 5-6 minutes to tell you about the programs.
Okay. Hi, so my name is Emma. I am the program director at Parents for Peace, where I've been working for a year and a half, developing the methodology behind the interventions that we've led. So I wanted to start off by giving a bit of an overview of the different programs and interventions that we use and the way we've modeled our intervention. So we operate with a hotline that was modeled on the same system as domestic abuse, suicide prevention hotlines, where anyone worried about loved ones falling into radicalization can reach out to us. So most often we end up working with parents who have kids who's gotten involved into an extremist group, or who's gotten radicalized within an ideology. So we work across the ideological spectrum, from we have Antifa cases to QAnon, white supremacy. So we really treat every form of extremism in its own way. And so we have a whole team where we start with an intake assessment when people reach out to our hotline. We ask questions related to basically focusing on building this like biopsychosocial profile, which is like a very fancy way of asking questions about the family dynamics, the mental health, any history of trauma, interpersonal relationships. And we also do a value risk assessment because our grasp is limited as a public health nonprofit and an intervention program. We really focus on mostly prevention. So often when we do have cases where it is an urgent risk of violence or a threat of harm to self or to others, we ensure that the families reach out to 911 or other entities that can help us in those situations. And then once this intake is done, we undertake an assessment in order to evaluate and to design what we call like a treatment plan in order to best treat the particular case involving the family or like, and so it's mostly parents, but we also have partners, spouses, and anyone who then undertake this basically intervention with an interventionist who has received some training in the past. And then we do hour-long interventions on a weekly basis or monthly, depending on availability. And then we use what we call a radical behavioral scale in order to assess the success of a case and whether or not it's ready for upfronting. So we work, everything is produced and provided internally, but we also, because of certain licensing issues or obstacles that we find, we work on a local level with other additional support network, therapists or other public health professionals and providers in order to provide like a holistic care. And so we mostly work on the referrals from family, but we've also worked within the prison system as well with the U.S. Probation Office or with like the Defender's Office and the Prosecutor's Office. So that's it for the introduction.
That was just the introduction. That was great. I'm Richard A. Warren. I run a group in New York called the Crime Commission. The Crime Commission's mandate is to develop innovative ways to try and reduce the most extreme forms of violence. In New York terms, that takes you to high-risk, very violent gangs, very violent gang members, gun trafficking, possession of guns by youth. We have a particular focus on that because of the dangerous relationship, the toxic relationship between that. And and then of course the extremism space. I'll focus on the extremism space. We now run, as Rachel said, a program called DEEP. DEEP originated in the National Security Division of the Department of Justice. We took it over in its very earliest stage to essentially a mentoring program. We were asked by DOJ to see whether or not we could provide some of our gang prevention ideologies and methodologies into the terrorism space. We frankly readily said yes, and spent a good year and a half after that speaking with actually many people in this room, every subject matter expert we could possibly find, worked through the government to get all the experts from the government, worked with the private sector and academia, and then worked with a team of forensic psychologists, developed a mental health-based intervention. I am not trained in mental health. I'm a lawyer by training. I'm a former violent crime prosecutor, so I don't use esoteric terms. That's why I'll spare you the misuse of it. So DEEP operates in the following way. In a lay sense, in New York, we think of terrorism cases as falling into three categories. A level one case is someone that either the FBI or NYPD or some other agency begins to learn, maybe engaging in activity that may be quite threatening and could blossom into something that could be quite dangerous. So level two is a case where a person has begun to actually mobilize, may have actually taken a step or two towards committing some act. And then level three is a full-blown terrorism case, where we have indicted for lending material support or any of the number of terrorism statutes. We work on level one and level two cases. We receive referrals from the FBI, NYPD, other agencies, 2 of the 5 DAs, they have jurisdiction over terrorism cases, and both of the U.S. Attorney's offices, as well as some other attributes of the federal government. For these level one and level two cases, these are cases where either the government is about to make an arrest and is trying to decide whether or not to do so, or has actually made an arrest and is trying to figure out whether or not to fully prosecute it, and then right down to the system. We deal with cases literally from pre-arrest to post-sentence. The idea is to take individuals, again, where jail is not, where prison is not the obvious outcome, get them into this intervention, and then work with them for as long as it takes to try and, in a sense, drain the violence out of them. By that I mean this. We do not focus on ideology. We are ideologically agnostic. But we do focus on those behaviors that might drive an individual to violence. And DEEP is very focused on preventing that violence. The program is administered by LCSWs that we train. We currently have 3 or 4 that are with us now, and cases are coming in that is somewhat steady cases, not a plethora of cases coming in right now, but they're coming in at a steady pace. People stay with us for quite a while, and then when the therapist indicates to us that they may be getting to the end of their utility of the therapy, we pass them on to a team member we call behavioral intervention specialist, or narco is, who really does the aftercare, stays with the person for a while and makes sure they fully reintegrate into whatever life they were living. And then, of course, we also, like everybody else, provide a lot of wraparound services for individuals that need it, and that can be ongoing as well. In addition to DEEP, we're working on a program with Moonshot, who was mentioned before, to design an online to offline intervention. We are handling the offline part and working with DEEP, working with Moonshot to find the right language, and this is super tricky, but finding the right language to encourage people who are searching online, looking for a special place online, to come offline and work with us. And we will do that both virtually, and then we are also training on the ground resources. To supplement that, we've just recently added staff to train all of the mental health workers in New York State to recognize the signs of mobilization, and when they recognize it, to actually know what to do to treat it. And we've actually designed materials extracted from DEEP that we will be giving out. And then we're also working with the mental health associations in New York, as well as the social work school, to try and build this into the professional practices guide, as well as into the curriculum. And then we have other programs going, but I think that's probably good for this group for now. I don't want to take up too much time.
Thank you. One of the things that I've really appreciated about the conversation today is how much I'm hearing some of the same themes over and over. And first of all, how much of a love fest we're having for social workers, which I'm just going to continue as well. I'm actually a psychologist by training, but I work with and I oversee a team of social workers and peer mentors. And I joke with our social workers that they're radicalizing me to social work. So the other great thing I think you're hearing in each panel is this consistent theme of the kind of individualized services that we need for people who are involved in or at risk for committing targeted violence. And so at Exit USA LA, Dr. Kate, as I said, we have a team of social workers and peer mentors. We work with two different populations. One we call exiting individuals. These are adults who are or have been involved in violent far-right extremist movements or behaviors. The vast majority are self-referred. They come because they are unhappy in some way with their involvement. They're disillusioned with the social networks, with the behaviors. They're starting to question the ideology. I don't want to make it sound like everyone is motivated to change when they come, but there is some part of them that's questioning their involvement. We also have people who've been referred or we would say strongly encouraged by family members to seek services and support, and some who have been mandated as a condition of their supervised release. And our work with these individuals really is characterized by the philosophy of compassion with accountability. We need to meet people where they're at. That phrase has been used today. We need to understand what their individual needs are, what their barriers are to exiting, and how we can address those barriers. And so with that, we're using the National Association of Social Work model of case management. Again, looking at those pull factors that we know are associated with disengagement and de-radicalization from violent extremism. So the case managers are doing one of those biopsychosocial assessments that Emma mentioned, assessing all of those needs and barriers, and then figuring out an intervention and a set of goals for that individual that address what they are willing to work on, and also what we see are some of their needs and some of what we can make change in. One of the referrals we might be making is to one or more of our peer mentors. And the peer mentors do a lot of work on problem solving around disengaging from the behaviors and disengaging from the social networks, which can be a really challenging issue for individuals who are engaged in these movements, actively engaging and then figuring out how to get away from the social network, or figuring out just how to live their life without the behaviors that they've come to find as habitual in their lives. The peer mentors do a lot of problem solving around that disengagement. They also can challenge ideology in a way that we often can't do in the social work case management context, and that we find that the mental health providers may not be able to do as well. So we're assessing a stage of change, and when people are at a stage of change where they're ready to address ideology, our peer mentors are really willing to engage with those conversations. And I also just want to emphasize that the peer mentors and the social workers serve as a pro-social contact for an individual who may not have any nonviolent social networks or doesn't have a social network where they can talk about their involvement and their beliefs and their behaviors in an open way. So if nothing else, we're serving as that pro-social social network in a transitional time until they can build their own pro-social network. We do a lot of skills training with individuals. This has been talked about throughout the day. Some of those just gaps, I think of them as developmentally displaced skills. Depending on when someone became involved in these movements, they may have missed out on the kinds of lessons that many of us learned in our late teens and early 20s, like how to be a good employee, how to be a good friend, how to be a good partner, how to be a good parent. And some of those basic skills need to be filled in because those become a barrier to reintegrating into society, to disengaging from that from that violent social network and behavior and moving into a pro-social role in pro-social social networks. So we also work with family members who have loved ones who are involved in the violent far right.
Most often this is parents, and we see a lot of parents of adolescents, but also of emerging adults who may still be living in the home. We sometimes work with some spouses and adult siblings or adult children of individuals who are involved in the movement. Similarly, we're providing case management services. Again, in both cases, we're consistently looking for safety risks and those risk and threat assessments. And then really looking at what that family client needs, both in terms of what that individual family member needs, but also what the family system may need in terms of referrals and the kinds of resources that might help support their families. We have a psychoeducation and support group that's a 9-week session covering topics for our family members, like setting healthy boundaries with your loved one, having conversations, difficult conversations about their behavior or their beliefs, appropriate consequences when those boundaries have been violated, and recognizing your loved one's motivation to change. We also have some peer mentoring that we're piloting right now with the families, and we have a mother of a former violent extremist who serves as a peer mentor to other parents, really problem solving around some of those boundaries and issues we're seeing with parenting. And specific to that parenting, we are actually working on modifying a empirically based parenting curriculum for our population, because we're seeing some very specific needs for parents that we think we can address perhaps with a parenting skills curriculum. So that's kind of the comprehensive overview of what we're doing in Life After Hate. I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel to moderate the questions.
Okay, so I do have, I'm just gonna shout here.
I do have some prepared questions, but I don't mind also Ashley or Neil, anyone who wants to pass along the question. Happy to entertain those. But first, I was curious about the support that is available for families. We know how much friends and family members know about their loved one and the concerning behaviors that they're dealing with and stress that causes. How do each of your programs address the needs of families or interface with them?
Sure, I can start. Well, so our approach is in the name of the organizations, really focused on, so we really believe that the family environment, what we can also call the life sphere, acts as a pillar and a mentor, especially throughout that disengagement or de-radicalization work. And so for us, something that we realized very quickly is the saying that we use often when we do the intervention, and we tell the parents is, you can't give out of an empty river. So if you want to be a mentor and if you want to help your loved one who's getting radicalized, who's getting involved in those groups, you have to make sure that you practice self-care. And that can take many forms and many faces, depending on your needs and depending on what you have available as well, the resources you have. But it's something that we've noticed as well when we looked at the rates of success of cases of disengagement and de-radicalization or walking away from the group, was the most successful cases involved families, parents, loved ones that not only were educated and were equipped with the right tools in order to be able to act, but also had the capacity to look inward and to do that like self-care work and personal work in order to make sure that they were stable enough to provide for this. Because you can try as much as you want to convince a loved one that the decisions they've made are probably not the right one. But if they don't have an alternative sense of belonging that they can find in their family, then it might be unsuccessful or more difficult to work. Which is why we really focus our approach and our interventions on working with those family members that are willing to help and are willing to serve as a guiding force within the family environment. And just to add on, because what Sarah was mentioning, we also, for that reason, have created a peer support group, and which is modeled on basically provide on and on similar models in order to provide the family and the parents a platform and a space where they can meet one another, discuss and break down those barriers that often shame and guilt create, especially within the environment of extremism. And so we've done 2 cohorts of those peer support groups so far. The goal really being to create a sense of community and to develop also that organic sense of community when they do the upfronting, when so that we build sustainable programs when they disengage from services with parents.
And I'm so glad that you brought up the issues of shame and guilt, because that can be such a significant issue for the families that we work with. And again, we're probably seeing a subset of the population of families who have loved ones involved, because we're seeing the families who are reaching out for support. They're saying, we want to do something, we want to help. How do we help? And so we see a lot of that shame and guilt. We see a lot of isolation, a lot of those similar issues of not having anyone else to talk to about this without experiencing stigma from their loved ones as well. And so providing that social space to get that support, or providing a space where they can talk openly with the social worker or with the psychoed support group members, or with the peer mentor is really important, just to have that space for that connection. I think one of the other things that we see are families often, they may have reached out because they're concerned, but they are still minimizing, and they have a lot of ambivalence about really acknowledging the risk and the threat in their children. And as a parent, I can absolutely understand that. No one wants to think of your child as a potential mass shooter or as a violent individual. And no one wants to see the kind of consequences that their children could experience if they do go on to commit an act of mass violence. And so we really have to work with families carefully about helping them to see, not minimize what their child is involved in, and support them in understanding that the kind of interventions that we're going to support them in, and then potentially those times when we see there's a duty to warn or duty to protect, it really is about preventing their child from going on and doing something that will have catastrophic implications for their life, for their entire future, and for their family. And so, and sometimes that is an additional uncomfortable piece of the work we're doing, with the social workers are doing with the parents. And I already described a lot of the family services we have, so I won't go into that again.
So I'd like to pick up on that last piece, because I agree that it's an absolutely critical piece. So I actually have 2 different answers to your question. In the first instance, within D, most of the people that we are dealing with are in the system, in the criminal justice system. So our focus is on them. That is where the therapy is authorized, that's where the therapy is paid for. It's not for family therapy. That's not to say that individual therapists don't from time to time reach out to family members where they either need information or want to develop a dialogue for some relatively brief period. But deep is focused on the individual. And again, they're very often not just in the system, they're incarcerated, so it would be hard to do. But the second piece is something that I would really like to punch out, which Sarah was talking about. In this program, we have signaled this online to offline intervention. The second tier of that is developing a space online where parents and loved ones can go. The federal government calls this bystanders. I've been quite open about saying it's not a term that I like, because it implies a passivity to it. We're trying to encourage the currently active bystanders, if you will. So we reach out to online to loved ones and try and give them a safe space to find the resources they may need to not just report what's going on, but also to receive advice about what to do. And it's a very tricky thing, because most parents are not going to want to make a phone call to the FBI or to their local police, but if you can find some trusted interlocutor, usually community-based, they're likely to do that. Ditto people that may know someone radicalizing or mobilizing. They're not going to want to call the Bureau if they have a personal relationship with the individual. Interestingly enough, the data shows that most of the people that report this sort of behavior and not know the person that well. It's observational. So we're trying to breach that and provide that very, very safe space for people to come and get advice, get counseling, get help about what to do with a loved one. But I'm not gonna say this is easy. This is very, very hard stuff.
So I don't want to deny other people the opportunity to ask questions. So I just want to check in about the queue that we might have online. I see one hand up. So I have more prepared questions, but I want to give you the opportunity.
Thank you. So I have a question for each of you. The question for Life After Hate and Parents for Peace is, what is your national reach, especially in the pandemic? Do you do any in-person programming? Is it all just phone calls and Zoom calls? And then for Citizens Crime Commission, I'm wondering, given that your program is so affiliated with the EDNY DOJ, is there buy-in from the DOJ, especially as you've operated under a Republican and a Democratic president? And will DEEP be replicated throughout other jurisdictions in the United States?
Yeah.
Jordan, thank you. So yes, we worked under, actually this started under the Trump administration, and coming directly from the AG school. In fact, the AG actually endorsed the DEEP program and started DEEP associates in each of the U.S. attorney's offices throughout the country. I don't think that fully panned out for a number of reasons, but the plan is, Jordan, to run this pilot in New York, figure out what's working, what's not working, and then start rolling it out nationally in various forms and making it available in various forms. Not every jurisdiction is going to need a fully staffed up DEEP program. There just aren't the quantity of cases needed to justify that. But almost every jurisdiction does have from time to time a need for this. And when I say jurisdiction, it's not just federal. 2 nights ago, we got a call about our second 13-year-old who was getting involved in some very violent activity. So, and the federal government tends not to handle people that young. So we do. So we're taking those sorts of cases as well. In terms of buy-in, we are a DHS grantee. So there's obviously DHS buy-in. There's various levels of buy-in depending on which agency you're talking about. Some is better than others. And at some point, if we ever talk about evaluation, we should talk about how these cases progress and what the barriers are to buy-in. We tend to get much quicker buy-in at the state level than we do at the federal level, but the federal buy-in is now coming along quite well. COVID really slowed us down a lot, slowed everything down the line, but we've seen a definite uptick in activity in the last 6, 8, 10 months.
So the question about our capacity when it comes to the hotline and our reach. So we're fully remote. All the services that we provide are through this hotline, Signal, or Zoom conversations. So we've been working all across the United States. We have cases from Florida to Washington, through California and Wyoming. So we also work in Canada, and we recently have had certain cases from Australia and Ireland. So the only reason why we would ever put a case on a wait list is because we don't have the capacity to act. But at the moment, we're handling around 40 cases of radicalization across the United States. And we really fully developed the hotline during the pandemic. So it's been mostly remote. I know there's been certain interventions in person, but we haven't gone back to in-person interventions ever since life has started happening in my area.
Services are fully virtual and nationwide. So meetings are typically held by video, and right now we're using a electronic medical record that allows us for video meetings. We can also message with people Depends on the individual, but most people are seen on video and then there's some phone calls.
I mean, I imagine that that just perpetuates some isolating feelings that you're literally alone in your room, talking to somebody in another room. Do you find that that is just as effective as being in person, or is this just the only option?
It's a really good question. I think that I have a couple answers to that. First of all, the people who typically self-refer to us are very, very secretive, and they don't want anyone to know that they're talking to us for a very long time. And so it actually, I think, works in our benefit that services can be virtual. It also is an additional safety measure for our staff. Let's be clear that these are individuals who are often threatening the demographic makeup of my social work staff, and they would be the targets of their violence. And so having that added benefit of being in a virtual space, of being at the distance, does help to create that additional sense of safety, even though they're on video and face to face. We're also really mindful about our staff safety and their sense of safety. I also want to kind of push back on our culture, assuming that online relationships are not real or valid or as rewarding as in-person relationships. And what we're finding, of course, is that many people, if not most, are radicalizing online, and they're radicalizing in these social networks that are online. And those are meaningful spaces for them. And how many of us have only ever met on Zoom before this and then met in person for the first time, maybe now or in Pittsburgh a few months ago, and still feel like we have real true relationships with people, even though this might be the first time we've seen each other in three-dimensional space. So I think that idea that the most quality kind of relationship contact is face-to-face in person in the same room. We don't necessarily have to have that to have a really quality contact with somebody. So I think that we forget that those are real relationships that people are in online, and that's why they're getting sucked into these movements. And these can be very real relationships with us in a virtual space that pull them back out.
I want to really also, I fully agree with everything you just said. And I want to add, like, there may be, when you think of a typical day for an intervention at Parents to Peace, they have 5 to 6 interventions. Sometimes they have 3 interventions of an hour back to back. So this online dimension and relationship also enables us to provide this quantitative services that would be impossible today to provide if we had to travel from California to New York. And so I think this online aspect really enables us to be everywhere and to create those relationships that can be very meaningful, even though online, while doing the work that we do.
Well, that is now covered. Jordan, the phraseology of your question in some ways indicates the answer. You said these people are already alone and now they're talking alone, but they're talking. And the key is for the first time they're talking with someone who's not necessarily a recruiter. They're talking with someone with a mental health work. And that makes all the difference in the world. A. B, I don't know if you know this, but particularly in the traditional crime space or mental health interventions at stored, therapists are finding a lot more willingness of people who are in on more traditional crimes, much higher willingness to speak online than they will in person, particularly in the beginning. And I wholly associate myself with the staff security issue. It just takes the security question out, and that's really.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for a wonderful panel and a great event. I apologize if this is loud. I feel like you can hear myself. So I'm going to ask the question, and then I'll offer a little on why I'm asking. So the question is, where do we see capacity limitations with these efforts, especially with you guys working directly with families and with the smallest level, right, of these kind of rings. And I ask that because I'm looking more at international focus. So I'm working on a report right now on engaging with NGOs, doing some field research in West Africa, and how can we support CSOs NGOs that have, youth, women, capacity building projects as a way to mitigate the spread of terrorist violence, right? So how can we, in these areas where there's less resources and less attention, right? Like they have their capacity that they have is energy and effort and time. And that's the limitation that these larger partner entities have, right? That's the limitation that can be kind of supported. So there are other ways in this domestic realm where a capacity limitation for someone could be a capacity opportunity for someone else.
You're looking at me, I'm not sure why. I've got the mic. So I think there's another aspect to your question domestically, internationally, I've addressed separately. I think the other capacity limitation is money, is having the finances out there to bring in enough staff in order to maintain the kind of work that has to be done. And we, through some work, frankly, with the insurance carriers, figured out a way to actually code these cases of intake so that traditional insurance, whether it's private insurance, Medicaid or Medicare, will actually cover the cost of the therapy. That has been an enormous help for us because we were funding these therapeutic sessions, frankly, which is getting extremely expensive. The other source of money, and then I'll talk about actual individual therapeutic capacity, is the courts very often have money. And the defense bar, for us, that's very relevant, very often has money, and that takes the financial burden off us as well. So when you talk about capacity, I think you have to build in not just the human capacity, but the financial capacity question as well. Jordan, circling back to Jordan's question, the fact that this is all now online has made it, we have found, I don't know you, but we have found it easier to recruit LCSWs, clinicians, to come in and do this work. We did find some hesitation pre-COVID, but we're now finding it easier and easier and easier to recruit therapists to do this. It requires some training. We pay them to go through the training. We hook them up with a supervisor. We pay for that. But otherwise, insurance covers their costs. And frankly, some people are very interested in the space and happy to pick up that funded kind of client.
I think that's a great question. And I think what you have, at least it sounds like in the space that you're in, is a lot of, as you said, energy and excitement. And you do have those human resources there. And I think in that case, it's a matter of training paraprofessionals in these models, training them in case management. I mean, case management is not always provided by licensed social workers. We use licensed social workers because they come with training and then they come with the understanding of the ethics code that we expect them to follow and so on. But there are many places where people are providing case management who don't have a social work background, who don't have a license to practice social work as an LSW. And so you can train non-social workers in a case management model. You can train peer mentors to be peer mentors. And in our case, we are using farmers as peer mentors, but I really would love to see us expand out to non-farmers as peer mentors. We can never have enough pro-social relationships wrapping around these individuals. And so you can leverage lots of different members of your communities to be intervening with people. I think we need to step out of thinking of this as it's just a mental health issue. I mean, I am a clinical psychologist. I feel like a traitor to my profession by saying this, but we're not necessarily the answer in every case. We have skills and training and education and background that may be meaningful and important and helpful in these cases. But I also have seen incredible work with our peer mentors, who I am amazed at some of the progress that we can see with someone when they just come to trust one new person, and then their willingness to trust yet another new person, and their willingness to engage and to think about the world in a different way, simply because we have started with that one peer mentor and then kind of worked our way out. So capacity building, I think, is also building out all of our systems and all of our members of our community to see themselves as part of the solution. as another person who can engage with an individual. And it can be a single kind of engagement and intervention to a sustained kind of relationship. And those things can be really meaningful in getting people to disengage.
And to add on to that, I think one of the barriers that we've seen as well is that very often when it comes to healthcare providers and different professions within public health professionals, a lot of people do not know that they have a role to play. A lot of social workers, and I'm talking in training or clinical psychologists, don't, because the issue of extremism has been framed in a criminal justice manner for so long, they don't understand how they could have a responsibility or how they could have an impact on someone's de-radicalization or on identifying early warning signs of radicalization. We often see those 3 areas of action for what we were talking about bystanders. The first one is people don't know how to identify early warning signs of radicalization and they don't know what to do. The second one is they know how to identify them, but they don't know what to do. The third one is they know how to identify, they know what to do, but they're afraid of doing so. So then you have to tackle into the fear of it as well. And I remember, I'm going to echo something that I think Dr. Emma Cordelli said in Pittsburgh when she was talking about her training of being a clinical psychologist, which was that she was taught during that training to always sit next to the door to escape in case there was any kind of danger. And I think that's also part of it in the training and the question. We're talking about extremism that's already been framed in so many ways in homeland security perspective. And so that factor of the security and the danger is prominent in the discussion. And so healthcare providers sometimes fear for their own safety getting into this work, which is a barrier that we have to address and that we have to tackle. And maybe it's through the public health model, maybe talking openly and honestly about the actual dangers and the safety aspects of it, like we're talking about the online components. So I think that even on top of all those issues and the resources and the investment, there's also both the lack of knowledge and understanding and education of the issue, but also the fear that creates those obstacles to entry.
Okay, and this is gonna be our last question also.
Sarah, you spoke about sort of the life skill deficiencies that you see in a lot of the people that you interact with. Could you explain the treatment process, the pipeline, the resources that need to go into, I guess, making somebody whole?
Oh boy. Well, and I guess I want to echo that or say again, this is so individualized. So step 1 is doing an assessment of that individual's needs. Where are they coming in? What was their level of involvement? How long were they involved? What age were they when they got involved? And then trying to get a sense for how they're functioning in the world. And you can get a sense, again, and it's that initial interview, both that are screening interviews, but also those initial biopsychosocial interviews of assessing how is this person functioning in the world? What might be some of those barriers, those skill deficits? So if we see someone who is having difficulty holding down a job, is it that they're having difficulty because they really lack the basic understanding of you have to show up every day on time and stay for your entire shift? Or are there other interpersonal issues? We've had clients who, particularly those who've been incarcerated, have learned coping mechanisms while incarcerated that kept them safe, but are not functional in the real world. So when they're at work and someone stands too close to them when they were imprisoned, that would have been a threat. That was an indicator of a threat to their safety. Someone was about to attack them. And reflexively, they're punching their coworker, which is not an adaptive behavior in the workplace, if anyone was wondering. We discourage that. So sometimes it's going to be a matter of just talking about, these are the ways you learn to cope and to adapt in this situation. They're not applicable here. Let's think about what pieces of them are really important and acknowledge how they helped you and how they're not going to work in this kind of setting. It may, and we also hear this actually about being at the grocery store. So this can become an interpersonal issue. You're out with your family, you're out with your partner, you're out with your friends, and somebody stands too close to you in line. And it makes you want to react aggressively. And maybe you're not actually physically acting out, but you're actually verbally attacking someone, which makes people not really want to spend time with you. So these are the kind of individualized assessments, very granular example of that. And there are some problem solving training courses you can do, a problem solving curriculum. There's emotion regulation curriculums we've used. There are all of the different variations we tried, just emotional awareness curriculum. But again, it becomes a matter of talking to that individual and seeing where those barriers are for that person in those particular environments. And it's really, it starts with that assessment and then that individualized approach.
We queued a little early. You still have 15 minutes, Rachel, if you would like to have your question.
Thank you so much for a fascinating panel. I have a question. You mentioned, Sarah, that mental health professionals get a lot of expectations in fixing the problem, violent extremism. And I understand that some of the pathways towards violence do come through individual level psychological challenges, mental health challenges. Some of them come through ideological conviction of the injustice of different types, and may come from people or may be experienced by people who are psychologically healthy, who are socially competent, who are highly educated, and they engage in this violent behavior. So teaching them not to punch the person who stands too close to you may not be, as you said, you will come up with individualized approaches. Do your organizations also serve those people? And how do you serve them? Because changing the society, because some of their grievances may be rooted in reality, and changing that reality is extremely difficult. What do you do in those cases?
Thank you for asking that, actually, and I want to give Emma a chance and Richard as well to answer this, but briefly, I would say, yes, we do work with those people too, and I want to echo something I believe that Mia Bloom said earlier, which is we don't want to conflate lack of educational opportunities and achievement and occupational engagement with violent extremism. It is not true in all cases. So we do have people who are highly employed, they're very employed and very esteemed and prestigious professions who have gotten involved in these movements. In those cases, and with every case, I think what you have to do is acknowledge the grievance. It doesn't mean we have to agree with the grievance. It doesn't mean we have to agree with their approach to resolving the grievance, but we have to acknowledge they have a grievance of some kind, and then try to understand what else is behind that grievance, but how else might we resolve that grievance? And so it may not be a mental health issue. I'm going to walk back. Everything I just said about mental health providers are not the only answer to this. I do think there's a lot that we can learn from mental health interventions and that mental health providers do have to bring to this, because ultimately what we're looking at are maladaptive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. It's that psychological triad that we're always looking at. If you think something, it's going to make you behave in one way and feel one way. You have a feeling, it's going to make you think one way and behave another way. And that constant interaction of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors we see with these individuals. So we can use some of those interventions we know that address maladaptive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. We see maladaptive emotion regulation. We see behavioral dysregulation. So we have a lot of interventions, again, that can work. Behavioral interventions, particularly when people are actively engaged or in the earliest stages of disengagement, the behavioral interventions and activity scheduling can be a really ideal intervention. So those, I do want to say, like, we can have mental health providers involved in this. But the conversation I often have with mental health providers is, we're not asking you to de-radicalize someone, we're asking you to treat their anxiety disorder. And so and right now in particular, have a client who has a very, very clear and prominent anxiety disorder. It's abundantly clear, even to non-professionals who are interacting with this individual. And I spent quite a bit of time talking to the psychologist who's working with him, who is grappling with how do I handle the fact that he's got this offensive ideology, but he also has this really serious anxiety disorder that needs to be treated, that is actually what's driving his engagement with this far-right content and belief system. And so we're not asking, mental health providers shouldn't be asked to de-radicalize someone, we should be asked to be treating, in many cases, the psychological disorders and the other maladaptive things going on underneath the surface.
Yes, I completely agree, with that. The theory of change that we use at Parents with Peace to think about extremism and radicalization is that, individuals who go through an identity crisis that can take many forms, mixed with what we call unaddressed grievances. So again, unaddressed grievances can range from a mental health diagnosis or misdiagnosis sometimes to a history of trauma, to substance use. They can take really many forms, create that vulnerable space they then fill by rumors and reporters that then leads into radicalization. So our goal is really to, when we do this like biopsychosocial profiling, when we do this intake and we ask all these questions, what we really hyper focus on is being able to identify those grievances. Because we believe that extremism should serve as a drug of choice and acts in a similar way as addiction does. Just like when someone reaches out for a bottle, what are they trying to numb? And so we think of extremism in a similar way. It's when someone is engaging in an extremist ideology or in hateful speech and discourse, what anger, resentment, suffering, and pain are they trying to channel and are they trying to numb? And so our goal is to really look into and try to identify those grievances, be they real or perceived, that's another question, but really to identify them, to question them, and to work on them in order to be able to heal them. Because we highly believe that if we do this, we mitigate the risk of either recidivism or radicalization in the first place.
So I'm going to articulate some lay terms, as I said at the beginning, I'm not a mental health worker, I'm not trained in mental health work. So I may be saying something somewhat similar, but I think it's actually slightly different. I said in my opening comments we're ideologically agnostic, and that we focus on the manifestation of violence, not the ideology. And I meant that with precision. We see a line between a person who is radicalizing, being driven by some ideology, may have very deep grievances, often does, but it's not yet begun to express violence or begun to mobilize toward violence. Now, okay, we're dealing with people in the system, so they are pretty far down the track. We focus on that violent expression. We do not try and talk them out of their ideology. We find that to be an incredibly complicated, frankly, often useless path because you don't get there. But we do find success in addressing their transition into taking that ideology into a violent state. And so that is our focus, the willingness to use violence and to work with that person so they denounce the violence, even though they may not denounce the ideology.
So, with the few minutes that we have remaining, I want to spin off what you were just saying, Richard, which is how do you know when your interventions are working? How would you define success?
All right, sure.
Something nobody wants to go.
Great question. So that was one of the big things that we wanted to address is like, how do you evaluate, I know there's a panel on this, so I'm sure we can learn from it later, but how can we evaluate the success of radicalization and disengagement or any kind of intervention where this work? And so what we started doing basically with a team of interventionalists that I work with at Parents with Peace, we started sitting on all those interventions, listening and taking notes and coding patterns that we started to see. What are the things that kept coming back? What are some techniques that we used that were successful, that worked? When did we see healthy communication patterns being implemented within the family environment? When did we see someone spending less time online and engaging less? And so out of probably, I would say, thousands of interventions that were coded, we designed 8 indicators that we use as a tool to measure whether or not someone, was getting more engaged or less engaged into an ideology and into a group. And so those indicators range from using unhealthy coping mechanisms to learning positive coping skills and implementing them, to having your mental health unsupervised and your needs not getting access or participating in any mental health support, to actually doing so and relying on it and seeing improvements, to engaging with your family engaging with you. So we have a lot of those different indicators that we use. And we didn't want to think in binaries in terms of like success or successful or unsuccessful or radical or de-radicalized. We developed a scale out of it to really be able to illustrate the nuances and the intricacies as well of someone that can make certain improvements into one of those indicators and yet stay stagnant in others, which is also a very good way for us to use as a guiding compass to know what we needed to focus more on and maybe what additional support networks we could introduce within this work in order to do so. And then we did the review sessions with the family. And so there's of course a lot of things that are going to be lacking because often there is a bias from the family because it's self-reporting. So some families might undermine certain aspects that we were talking about earlier. They might hide something that are variables that we can't control and that we have to live with. But we're trying to really develop this tool and use it with as many families as possible and work with different people within the field as well in order to make sure they with like the most holistic and comprehensive assessment of a case. But that's something that we're still working through and that we're hoping like through we're also using transparency to get evaluated in order to see how we can make it better and improve it so that you can really represent the best tool to use in that assessment capacity.
I find this to be a very complicated question on any number of levels. We think of evaluation, I think slightly different, maybe because you're more established, you have a longer track than we do, but in the space we're dealing with, we are literally trying to convince the government to do something it never wanted to do and doesn't want to do. So to me, one of the first hurdles that needs to be evaluated is whether or not a program is successful in developing adequate number of governmental partners who are willing to refer matters to you, again, in an environment where they are generally risk averse because of the catastrophic potential consequences that can flow if they refer to the wrong case. That is a big hurdle, and it's something we spend a lot of time working on. And at this point, pretty successful. It's taken a long time, and I come out of that community. So that's been tough. I think there's also a question around sustainability. Are you building programs that are sustainable, or are you going to be, as somebody said to me the other day, scurrying around for funds every 18 months? Are you building a program that has sufficient financial integrity and institutional integrity that it can be self-sustaining at some point, and have you built an adequate financial model to cover that? I think there's also a question of evaluation around the actual program, whatever your methodology is. Does that have integrity and credibility within the psychology community, if you will, with academics in this space or practitioners like Sarah, find what you're doing to be adequate? Are your trainings of social workers, again, we're reaching out throughout the state and training people, and we're going into another phase now where we're actually starting to go into the community. Is your training of people adequate? Are they getting the right amount of training so that they can actually stand alone and do the kind of intervention that you design, or do you need to be there all the time? And I have not even yet gotten the cases. Then yes, we look at behavior modification. We look to see whether or not those behaviors that may have indicated your propensities towards violence have been impacted by the therapy. But that's really down the road, and I respectfully suggest, at least in our space, that there are so few cases in this area that it's very hard to develop any statistically sound basis upon which to say A is working or it's not. but I know that that threshold has to be crossed. So I find the evaluation question to be really multi-layered. If we really want to take a real deep diagnostic look at what makes a good program versus what makes a program that may not last.
So this was a plug to stay for the last panel of the day where we're gonna be talking about assessing disengagement, and we have an incredible group of people here. So what I would say in terms of our services at Life After Hate, what we're looking at are the individualized goals. What does the individual come in that we see in the case management assessment and our own assessment of ideology, behavior, and social network targets for intervention? How many of those goals have been met? We kind of have three levels of graduation. One would be disengagement. Have we disengaged from the social network? Have we disengaged from the behavior? Are we no longer engaging in whatever violent far-right extremist related behaviors they were engaging in the first place? Have those stopped? Are they no longer engaging with that social network? The next piece would be reintegration. And to us, that's having pro-social roles in the community and having pro-social relationships. So it's not enough to just leave that set of antisocial peers and social network. We need to build a healthier social network that they find rewarding. Do they have a life that to them feels rewarding and meaningful, where they have personal significance? And they're living the kind of life that they want. And then ideally, we want to see de-radicalization. We want to see that change in that belief system, that justification of violence, that dehumanizing of an out-group, and that identity related to that, that what makes them important is not either their race and ethnicity, their engagement in this group, or their identification with this group, but they have a pro-social identity or a multifaceted identity, ideally, from which they derive self-esteem. So we are still working on that assessment of what it means to show that we have successfully disengaged someone, and that's still in progress. And so that's why I'm excited to say.
All right. Please join me in thanking our team.